Hi, and welcome to Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Today I'm going to read to you from Something Lost, from the Funerals and Weddings series by Bernadette Marie. Chapter 1. The thought crossed his mind. Had he ever been to a funeral when it wasn't snowing or raining? Craig stepped out of his car, opened the back door, and pulled out his overcoat. Shrugging it on over his suit, he buttoned it up and adjusted his scarf. Cars pulled into the lot, and he watched as others followed the same routine he did to ward off the cold that nipped at him. "Hey, Turner!" Craig turned at the calling out of his last name. A smile came to his lips as Raymond Stewart manoeuvred between the cars and headed toward him. There were no handshakes. Each of the men opened their arms and embraced the other. "It's so good to see you," Ray said, as he pulled back and scanned a look over Craig. What a crappy reason to get together. What an honour though, huh? After all these years, and they ask us to be his pallbearers. "I'm not going to lie, I was a bit surprised to get his son's email," Craig admitted. "No matter whatever happened between all of us, and the other players that came and went, the five of us had a bond with him. I can't help but think we were replacements for Theo. Maybe we dulled his pain some." Craig wasn't so sure about that. How did a man ever get over the loss of a child? He tucked his hands into the pockets of his coat and pulled out the gloves he stored there. Slipping his hands in the lined leather, he watched his breath carry on the cold air. "When was the last time you talked to him?" Craig asked, as he nodded toward the hearse. Ray tucked his gloved hands into the pockets of his coat as a frigid breeze blew between them. "Christmas card each year. His son got him on Facebook, so I chatted with him a few times there. Otherwise, I don't know when I actually spoke to him, other than at my wedding." Craig caught the sadness that flashed in Ray's eyes. "I heard about your divorce. I'm sorry, man." "Shit happens, right? It was a good 8 years and a few really bad ones. But we work well together when it comes to the kids. And that's the most important part." Ray pulled his sunglasses off his head and slid them on his face. "When did you talk to him last?" Craig noticed they were taking the casket out of the hearse and carrying it inside the church through the side door. He gave Ray's question some thought. "He got me my first sub job after college at a high school where he knew the staff pretty well. Gave me some recommendations over the years. Christmas card each year. I guess I didn't talk to him too much at all. I should have tried harder." He wouldn't have expected it. His job was to coach basketball and send us on our way. Craig had thought about that too. Maybe that was the man's purpose in his life. Coach had given him skills to advance in the sport he loved, but he'd also helped him grow into the man he'd become. Coach Diaz didn't have to go above and beyond, but he had, even when Craig crossed the line and dated Coach's daughter against his wishes. The man could have thrown in the towel and kicked him off the team. Instead, Coach Diaz helped Craig establish his career. That was why Craig was there. He owed it to the man who didn't hold grudges and had continued to care for him, even if Craig had broken his daughter's heart. "Look what crawls out of the gutters when there's a wedding or a funeral," the voice came from behind them. Craig and Ray turned to see Charlotte Ender Burke, Bruce Griffin, and Toby Maxwell all walking their way. It had been Alex that had called them out to them and reached them before the others. He pulled Craig in for a hug and then did the same to Ray. "Damn, it's been forever," he said as he slid his sunglasses to the top of his head. Bruce and Toby greeted them in the same way, and then the five of them stood in a small circle. Awkward silence had fallen between them before Toby spoke. "I can't believe Coach is gone. The memories, huh?" They all agreed, nodding their heads. Bruce tucked his hands into the pockets of his coat. This is like old times, the fabulous five back together. Except our hair is different, Craig joked, and they all laughed. But it's good to see you guys. Maybe after the funeral we can catch up. Alex nodded. My flight doesn't leave until tomorrow. Why don't we all drive to the cemetery together, and then from there we'll go somewhere. I'll drive and bring you all back here when we've done. Ray slapped a hand on Craig's shoulder. That sounds like a plan. Craig? This time when his name was called out, it was a woman's voice. He turned to see Coach Diaz's daughter, Rachel, standing near the family car. He turned his back on his friends and walked toward her. She was bundled up in a long wool coat, a scarf tied around her neck, and that long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Rachel, I'm so sorry about your dad, he said, as he leaned in and had kissed her on the cheek before he thought better of it. She was probably married, and now he'd crossed another line. Thank you. I'm pleased that you all came for the funeral and agreed to be pallbearers. It would mean a lot to him. Craig studied her black eyes, which hinted that they'd been filled with tears not long before she'd called out his name. It's our honour. He meant a lot to all of us too, though we should have kept in better touch. Rachel reached out and rested her gloved hand on his arm. He kept tabs on you all, his fabulous five, she said with a smile as she used his name for them. He was proud of everything you've done, she said, and now Craig could feel the sting of tears forming in his eyes. Wow, he said, blowing out of breath. That means a lot. I have to go inside. Hal will walk you all through the process. I'll see you at the cemetery too. Yeah, we're going to drive together and then go somewhere and catch up. Rachel's rosebud lips turned up into a smile. That would make Dad happy, to know he brought you all back together again. She retracted her hand and slid it into the pocket of her coat. I have to get inside. I'll get your number later. Maybe we could catch up. A knot formed in his stomach. I'd like that. Rachel turned back and headed toward the side entrance of the church when another man moved in next to her and slid his arm around her as they disappeared inside. She's still into you, Ray said as they all walked up behind Craig. She's in mourning. Statement stands. I think this could be an interesting weekend. Ray put his arm around Craig's shoulders, and the five friends walked into the church to say goodbye to the man who had made them a team. Chapter 2. Coach Diaz had touched many lives, Craig thought, as he sat down in the pew, his four best friends from college next to him. Coach's family in the centre pews next to them. Hal, Coach's son, had led them to their pew and let them know that they would only need to help with the casket at the cemetery. They'd each shook his hand and thanked him for thinking of them. Then the five of them sat at the front of the church as the service started. There were other faces in the church that he recognised. Catherine Anderson, Rachel's best friend, had caught his eye as she looked around at those who had gathered. She offered him a smile and turned her attention back to the front of the church. The ceremony highlighted Coach Diaz's life. A slideshow had been put together showing him from childhood through his last days. There, in the middle, were the photos of the teams he had coached through the years, including photos of Craig and his friends holding up trophies and banners, and even Coach Diaz on their shoulders. As the clip played, it warranted a chuckle from those in attendance. It hadn't gone unnoticed by any of them that Rachel and her mother both turned to look at them when the slide had come up. Perhaps their time with the coach had meant more to him than Craig had ever known. Maybe Ray had been right. They had been the team with Coach when his son had died, and they had rallied around him and his family. They'd won the championship that year too. Was that how Coach had managed? Were they a part of his recovery? During those pivotal years, Craig swallowed hard. He really should have stayed in touch with the man. When the sermon had concluded, the family rose, walked past the casket, and out of the church. Each row was then escorted out of the pew and filed past the open casket. The last row to file out was Craig's. He and his pals stood shoulder to shoulder, looking down at the man who was small and silver-haired. His hands rested on his stomach. On one hand he had his wedding ring, on the other the matching championship ring that each of the men looking at him had tucked away in their drawers. Craig drew in a breath. If it had meant so much to Coach to be buried with that ring, he'd sure as hell go home and find his own. They all stood over the casket in silence. Was he supposed to say something to him? Craig wondered. Could he quietly put his message of thanks out into the universe? Toby put his hand on Craig's shoulder. What a man. A dad to us all. God's team is sure to win now. Craig chuckled, but yeah, that's what he'd been thinking too. Rachel climbed into the family limousine as people began to emerge from the church. Her mother and brother had gone back through the side door so they could say goodbye to her father one more time before they closed the casket. She didn't want to see him again, not the way he was. She wanted to remember him full of life and not still and cold. As the church emptied out and people walked to their cars, she watched as Craig and his friends walked out into the frozen air. Each of them slid on their sunglasses and stuck their hands into the pockets of their coats. Then, as Craig had mentioned they would, they all walked towards his car and stepped inside. It had been 10 years since she'd seen him last. Just as she'd told him, her father kept tabs on his champion boys, and he always shared that news with her. What she and Craig had shared so many years ago was hot, young, and against her father's rules. She'd been 18 the year he turned 21, but she'd had eyes on the 6'2" centre since she'd been 15, and all but a fly on the wall around the college basketball team her father coached. Because her mother travelled extensively and her brother was in the Air Force, she spent a lot of time with her father and younger brother on campus. The older she got, the more she wanted to be around Craig Turner. She rested her head against the back of the seat as she watched her mother and brother emerge from the church. Her brother Hal had his arm around their sobbing mother. Rachel scooted over so that her mother could climb in next to her. Immediately her mother took her hand and gave it a squeeze. That's it, she sobbed. We'll never see his face again. Rachel wrapped her around her mother's shoulders and let her weep. When her father's casket had been loaded back into the hearse, Hal joined them in the car, dressed in his officer's uniform. Rachel thought he was the spitting image of photos she'd seen of their father at that age. Soon the hearse began to pull away from the church, and their car followed. Rachel could see the cars in the parking lot turn on their lights and form a line behind them. Every person was thinking about them, she knew, and it was an odd feeling to be on everyone's mind. Maybe it was because she knew it was temporary. Tomorrow, everyone who came out to celebrate her father would return to their lives. He'd be a memory that would come up from time to time, and perhaps someday they'd forget him. The thought stung because she knew that her father had never forgotten anyone, and that was part of what had made him such an incredible teacher and coach. When she thought about her father doing the things he loved in life, her mind wandered to Craig. She knew he'd become a teacher just as he'd planned to do. He'd even coached high school basketball. When her father found his boys, as he'd called them, on Facebook, he friended each of them. Of course they friended him back, and her father made it a point to show her what each of them had been up to. At the time, Craig was married, and though he and Rachel had never been as serious as she might have thought at 18, it had broken her heart to see pictures of him in a tuxedo next to the beautiful blonde in her wedding dress. She never friended him herself, but it hadn't stopped her from Googling his name or checking his profile over the years. 3 days earlier, when he'd accepted the invitation to be a pallbearer, he'd posted a photo of the two of them. He'd written a moving tribute to her father and tagged him in it. When Rachel had read it, alone in her tiny house, she had sobbed until Rover, her teacup poodle, settled into her lap to calm her. Now she knew that Craig was teaching at a community college and was no longer married to the blonde.